As you all move to exit the room through the northern door, an old sword that looks like it's been discarded suddenly flies up and over to you, gets between you and the door, and begins dancing in front of you. As soon as it seems that it has your attention, it flies over to the western door and begins beckoning you over. What would you like to do? Hello, and welcome to Tuna's Tales. In this entry of Pondering Monsters, we'll be covering the Flying Sword, a CR 1/4 Intelligence 1 construct with the, you guessed it, ability to fly. This one, however, seems very interested in getting your party to follow it. If you want to know why, then stick around as we dive into the nuts and bolts of this encounter. This encounter is fairly straightforward. All you need is some story in your campaign about a dungeon that holds some sort of powerful magic item. Whoever can reach the end of the dungeon can claim it. Now, no one knows what this item is exactly, but you can include some rumors for really anything here. Whatever it is, though, it's something powerful, and could be just what the party needs to collect to fight the BBEG of your campaign. To help with all of this, here's a map for a dungeon that you can use. The twist here, though, is that we give the party the item they're looking for right at the beginning. This flying sword, in fact. Yeah, that's the item. Now, I know what you're saying. Well, that's not a magic item, it's a creature. To that I say, why can't it be both? The idea here is that the flying sword follows the party through the dungeon. It may help them at times, it may inconvenience them at times, but throughout it all, the party should have plenty of opportunities to try role-playing with this creature. This is the real focus of this encounter, getting the party to roleplay with a low-intelligence construct. Something that I feel most players and DMs wouldn't normally give a second thought to, but who's to say that just because it has an intelligence score of 1 that it can't communicate? That's what we're going to focus on, but for now, let's keep looking at the summary here. At the end of the dungeon, after the party has survived the trials and fought the beasties, it should be revealed that the sword was the item they were looking for all along. It joining them was a test, and if they've passed, they've earned its trust. With the magic item in hand, they're free to leave and slay evil with it. This is where you can use this to give your party any magic item you want as a reward for completing the dungeon. Vorpal sword, flame tongue, something you've created yourself, again, whatever you want. The flying sword loses its creature status and just becomes the item in question. You don't even need to keep the flying sword as a sword, by the way. You could make it a flying dagger or a flying great axe if you wanted to. Just make sure to change the damage of the flying sword's attack as appropriate. Now, there are a few points that could be an issue that we need to think about before trying to run this. In no particular order, they are: what if the party attacks the sword at the beginning? What if the party figures out this is the item, just takes it and leaves? And what do we put in this dungeon? So, let's jump right into it with the first one. So, what if the party does attack the sword at the beginning of the dungeon? If they do, then there are actually a couple things you can do here. The sword could still follow them, but do so stealthily, and when the time comes, because the sword is bound by the magic of the dungeon, it reveals itself to them as the actual item they're looking for. The problem here is that now they haven't properly earned its trust, so you can feel free to add a little curse to the item, something like the Curse of Mistrust. While attuned to this item, you are cursed and cannot unattune from it willingly. While cursed in this way, you have disadvantage on all charisma-based checks, as people just get an off vibe about you, making it hard to trust what you say. This curse isn't meant to be permanent, and the character wielding it can work to gain the sword's trust in the future. But for the time being, this is a perfect opportunity to include some consequences to the character's actions. Plus, it sets things up for a potential future quest. You could also make it a little more rough by making the curse something like: all enemies have advantage on attacks against you when you are actively wielding the sword, as the sword doesn't fully trust you and will not aid in your defense. That's all well and good, but that's just one option. Another way you could go with it would be asking the question, what if the BBEG is looking for this item too? Now the sword is just laying there ripe for the taking, right at the beginning of the dungeon. The BBEG walks in and now has the sword they were looking for, and the party has to do some work to get it back. One thing you could do to drive this point home is to tell the players when they return to the beginning of the dungeon that the sword they attacked isn't there anymore. Follow this up with one of the BBEG's henchmen being seen with the sword a little bit later to really make it click. What if the party figures out this is the item, just takes it and leaves? And there are a couple of options if they go down this route. You could just say that the sword can't leave the dungeon until the fake item at the end is destroyed by touching it. If the party tries, then the sword just reappears back in the beginning. If you're not a fan of that, then how about just applying the curse from the last question to the sword? It's a similar situation where the party has not earned the trust of the sword yet, so the curse would still fit. And finally, what do we put in this dungeon in the first place? When trying to answer this question, I like to think along the lines of a theme. In this case, the first thing that came to mind is that the dungeon is filled with constructs. Given that the real item the party is looking for is a construct to begin with, it's not out of the realm of possibility that everything in here would be a construct too. Constructs are typically good guards, and what could be more important to guard than a mad tinkerer's greatest invention, a flying vorpal sword? You could use flying weapons of all types with this, along with animated armors, rugs of smothering. Heck, you could even include some planar-bound modrons if you really wanted to, and the list goes on from there. But monsters alone does not a dungeon make. With that in mind, mechanical traps, along with some magical ones as well, are also a good addition to this if you'd like. The crazy tinkerer that worked out of here probably had traps everywhere. Who knows if they all still work, but they are everywhere. So, with the burning questions answered and the encounter outlined, let's see what this looks like when we try putting it all together. As you all decide to humor the flying sword and walk over to it, it motions to you that it wants you to go through the western door here. As you open the door and peer inside, you see that the room in front of you is completely empty. So, assuming the party takes the hook and follows the sword, we now have a friendly flying sword that can aid the party in any combat they come across. If we're using constructs, we can say that the other constructs won't attack one of their own, but that's not stopping the sword from attacking them. As the party moves through the dungeon, the flying sword should try to insert itself into any conversations it can. It can't speak, but it can attempt to gesture by flying around. Other roleplay tips for this sword can include things like when the party is approaching a room filled with traps, the flying sword wishes to help them. It'll set off any traps it can, and if the party is in the middle of them, then oops. When it comes to enemies, the sword wishes to see glorious battle and goes charging into the fray before running back to the party and drawing the enemies towards them. Overall, the sword can serve as the perfect addition of comedy and escalation. It should frustrate the party a little bit, but be endearing enough that they don't want to hate it for it. When the party reaches the end of the dungeon and touches whatever decoy item is being guarded there, the item should crumble into dust at first touch. While whoever touched the item is looking at the dust in their hands, the flying sword flies over and lays itself in their hand. The character in question should notice something like some level of sentience leaving the sword or the magic that's affecting it changes. If you want to put this behind a skill check, then a low DC Arcana seems most appropriate. If you want to be real blunt with them, you could tell the character holding the sword that they get the feeling that maybe the treasure they were looking for was with them all along. And because I know some of you or your players might frown at losing a semi-sentient sword friend, you can always make the sword that they find a dancing sword. This also gives the DM the excuse to act as the sword sometimes outside of combat. Need a moment of levity in your game? The sword activates and does something relevant. The party is in some tense negotiations where there are no weapons allowed. They suddenly see the sword floating at the window, bouncing around, looking to be let in. At the end of the day, try to just have fun with it. Since this is more of a roleplay-focused encounter, there isn't really anything that we can do to scale it up. Interacting with the flying sword should be pretty much the same at any character level. When it comes to the dungeon, however, you can do things like increase the DC and damage for any traps, or use higher CR constructs like the various golems. There are several options here that I'll leave for you to decide what's best. And now we have a reason to act out a flying sword that's trying to play charades with our players. I've included a link to the map I mentioned earlier in the description, so feel free to pick that up and use it in your games. If you liked this encounter concept enough to try it at your table, then feel free to leave a like and let me know how it went in the comments below. If it really didn't vibe with you, or if you want to suggest creatures that I should cover in the future, then the comments are a great place for that too. And if you want to get notified when the next video gets posted, you should subscribe and do that thing with the bell. It also helps the channel out and is much appreciated. As usual, thanks for letting me talk at all of you, and until next time, keep pondering.